then scientific studies actually show a shared finances mindset leads to faster achievement of your financial goals and better relationship satisfaction, more sex. And so, with that evidence, for me, how you do it matters less than whether you choose to do it or not. I'm like, it's shared money is more about the shared mindset and less about the making sure that all of your accounts have both names on it.
Hi there. My name is Emily, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Plenty. My husband and I co-founded Plenty after we began merging finances and were shocked to find what a mess that could be. We'd both been in Silicon Valley working in fintech for over a decade each, so we set out to build something better. Today, Plenty is a wealth platform helping modern couples invest and plan for their future together. We bring the investment strategies and products of the wealthy to the everyday household. But we know it's not just about great products within relationships, it's also about the conversations. And talking about love and money is still very new. So that's what we settled to do in our podcast. And welcome back to another episode of Love and Other Assets, where we set out to talk about all things love and money to make it a little bit easier for you. Shang is the founder and CEO of Save My Sense, a nationally recognized and awarded financial coaching business that focuses on the influence of mental health on financial wealth. Feels like that's more needed now than ever. Shang teaches readers the key habits and behaviors needed to become less fearful of money and live life with joy. She received her bachelor's degree in economics from Harvard and her MBA from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Shang and her husband finished saving for their retirement by the age of 31, living out that FIRE lifestyle, and now lives a work-optional life in Southern California with their 2 boys and 2 cats. Shang, thank you so much for making time to join us on the show today.
Thank you, Emily, so much for having me. What a pleasure.
So I can't wait to hear all about this. You were able to reach that FIRE stage by just 31 years old. What was your journey to FIRE?
Yeah. And for those who don't know, FIRE is financial independence, retire early. It refers to a somewhat fringe group of people who practice extreme frugalism to save and invest a ton of money so that they can become what's considered early retired. The classical definition is when your net worth is 25 times your annual expenses, also known as the 4% rule. That was not in my bingo card in my 20s and 30s. That wasn't my original plan to be early retired. I luckily made good money coming out of school as a management consultant, and I'd always been taught by my parents growing up to be frugal, have a budget, don't get into credit card debt. So I was a natural saver. Relative to my friends, I believed I was more frugal than most. When my husband and I met and started dating, he actually started floating the idea of, hey, Shang, you know about that motherhood penalty, the one where your career might not look the same afterwards. You might worry about balancing money and kids. What if we did away with the fear of all of that and just learned to live off of the lower of our 2 incomes? And so for the first kind of year or 2 of our marriage, I further decreased my discretionary expenses so the 2 of us would live off of the lower of our 2 incomes. And eventually that, plus investing our savings and a really good run-up in the stock market, meant that by age 31, my net worth was 25 times my annual expenses, which I learned around that time was FIRE from a friend who told me to read about it, but I didn't realize that that was what we were doing the entire time.
So when you talk about extreme frugality, do you have any examples or experiences that come to mind of what that meant for you and your husband?
Oh my goodness. One time I was featured in the New York Post, and it's a sensational piece of journalism. They called me the millennial cheapskate. So on a typical day, we started out, our starter apartment was a stabilized apartment that we actually got through a friend. So the rent was super low. That was great. It's not in great condition. 420 square feet, super tiny. You have to stack and hide everything everywhere. We stacked our bed to make it bigger and leave stuff underneath. I left half of my shoe collection at work because my cubicle, I was like, look at all this space. There's so much space under my cubicle. Let's put my shoes there and my snacks. And didn't have a car. Obviously, in New York, you don't need it because you have the subway everywhere. Cooked pretty much all of my meals. I had a budget for how much to eat out. And we really took a lot of effort in researching like great hole in the wall style restaurants in New York. And we mostly traveled using credit card points and miles before it became like this huge thing that everybody now talks about. I kept what's called a capsule wardrobe, where I basically kept my closet to about 30 pieces of clothing, more so out of necessity because my closet that I shared with my husband was 2 feet wide. So there was not a lot of space. And so in some ways, just by the mere fact of being in New York City kind of led to the fact that we had to be very frugal.
Well, also, I think many people, especially when their income grows, they choose to expand their lifestyle as well. But that was a decision that you guys didn't make. So how early did you guys talk about that when you were dating? Like when you mentioned the conversation with your husband, at what point in your relationship did he bring that up?
I think around the time that we were engaged, but the concept of money was already a part of our conversation when we were dating. And I think that that's probably a little bit unusual. It's because both of us, independent of each other, were already very passionate about personal finance as a topic in our lives. And I guess fate had it that we had to meet and date each other.
Yeah. And when you were dating, did you look for it consciously? Was that like a thing where you knew that that was really important for you when you were finding your partner, and it was a facet of the compatibility? Or was it something that you got lucky and you happened to meet someone who ended up having such a similar passion for personal finance?
I mean, Emily, don't we all try to look for the 6-5 finance gap with the trust fund? No, just kidding. My definition of what I wanted in a significant other did change a little bit over time. My husband is only my second serious relationship. So I actually haven't had that many relationships to begin with. But I know that one quality I always looked for in a partner was a sense of responsibility. Responsibility around adulting, around life. Like they should know how to cook something minimally and pick up after themselves, keep a clean house and budget. So it wasn't like that I needed somebody to be great at personal finances, but I think with a great sense of responsibility also comes with a sense of, okay, adulting and being responsible, finances are part of it.
And now that you've worked with so many individuals and couples, what are some of the red flags that you've now seen that you could spot as early as when you're dating? And what advice would you give for people who see those red flags?
Oh my goodness. I can tell on a Zoom call if I think, well, a relationship is stable or not by the way that the couples look at each other or not look at each other when they answer a question. I've noticed that in dysfunctional relationships, when I speak to a couple over Zoom call, they're not making eye contact. They're not like looking at each other, kind of like confirming and nodding a little bit before answering a question together. And the way that they talk about each other, they often disparage each other. They're talking themselves down, talking each other down. In practice, in dating, the one thing that I look for like what I call red flaggy behavior is lack of transparency, like absolute refusal to talk about money or, even discuss money. And I'm like, look, we talk about other things. We talk about sex, sexual compatibility. We talk about our careers. We talk about our family lives. We should talk about money because it's a top reason for divorce. And so when people don't talk about it, red flags go up.
Yeah. That makes so much sense. For a couple who is not sure where to start, because maybe one person has debt, or maybe one person, has never grew up in a family where they ever talked about money. Are there any ways that you can almost take baby steps to talking about money with your partner?
I'm kind of, take a polar bear plunge all in. But I actually think a really great way to see firsthand how your partner handles money is to plan a vacation together. It doesn't have to be a fancy vacation, but I want you to plan maybe a weekend trip, a trip where you at the very least have to be 24/7 around each other. Because when you plan a vacation, first of all, you have to plan it. You can see whether they're planned or not. Then, how did they go about choosing a destination? How did they go about buying plane tickets or planning the car trip or whatever? What do they like? Are they going to go for the luxurious experience or not? What are they willing to pay for? And then as you kind of ask these questions as you plan the vacation, you get true insights into how each other worked. And that's actually how my husband and I first broached the topic of finances as well without talking about it head on. We, during spring break in business school, we started dating in business school. For spring break, we decided to go to Southeast Asia together. That was the first time that I saw that he also uses points and miles, like little travel hacky ways to bring down the cost of travel. And he was actually more of a saver than I was because he actually suggested that we book hostels to stay in. And I was not a hostel girl. I was like, hostels? Isn't that like for like backpacker people who smell? Yeah. So, now granted, some hostels can be really nice. Some of the nicest hostels I've been to are typically the ones in Europe and Canada. Love them. The hostel we were at in Southeast Asia was not nice. And that was like a whole day of fighting that I do not wish to revisit. But it's really funny in retrospect because that's how I first learned. Oh my. He was frugal. Oh yeah. And he said that was where he first learned that I had princess tendencies. So
I just learned that I might also have princess tendencies because multiple person room hostel is probably not where I'm at right now in life.
But it's not for everybody. It takes a special someone to agree to do a multi-person hostel for sure.
So I am so curious, you mentioned even that being a moment where you and your now husband had differences. And I'm sure there must have been more on your journey to reaching FIRE. Were there other moments that come to mind when you guys were talking about how to get to this milestone of FIRE where one of you you weren't on the, entirely on the same page, or maybe you were really close, but you just weren't at the exact same point?
Yeah. And I think that it's very normal for there to be differences of opinion and different ways of doing things. Even in a compatible relationship, you're not going to get two identical people because you don't want to date a copy of yourself. And for my husband and I, we both agreed it is important to build our careers, to build our wealth, to save and invest. But I think we disagreed a bit on the speed in that my husband, I think, came from a more scarce background where it's like whatever you can optimize, whatever you can be frugal on, you do it at all costs, which is the really extreme frugalism part of FIRE. Whereas for me, I came from the attitude of if we need more, I can always make more money. Like for me, I was more the abundant mindset of income's kind of infinite. I can be a business owner. I can go out and try to hustle more, but I don't think we're limited to what we're making today. And so in practice, when that plays out, it's often played out not so much on the needs things like our housing and food, like we agreed those are some basic needs. But when it came to nice to haves, in many cases, I was like, look, if we did the frugal option, I would lose time at work to try to take care of this, or I may lose out on a valuable career networking opportunity because I didn't have quote unquote enough budget for this, gathering. And I would be pissed because I would want to do it. And for him, it's like, it's not in the budget. We're not going to do it. And I'm like, that to me, that felt like a sacrifice that I wasn't always necessarily willing to make. It's still an ongoing discussion to this day.
Yeah. So how did you learn to work with it? Because it seems like you've clearly evolved and worked with it. One of the things I love that you mentioned is that it's not easy, and it is almost like these two different mindsets that are on opposite sides of the table. So what are some tips to resolve that?
In the beginning, we could not really resolve it. So we agreed that each of us would have a no questions asked budget, like a personal budget out of our shared budget. Um, I still didn't think it was enough because it was $1,000 per person per year. And I blew through $1,000 in one go because I was invited to be a bridesmaid at a wedding. And then so between the dress and the did we do a party, bachelor party? Yeah, the dress, the bachelor party, rehearsal, gifts, everything done. $1,000 gone in like within like 2 weeks of establishing this budget. But my husband, to his credit, gave more of his budget to me when he saw that happen. He's like, okay, maybe that wasn't a realistic start. The second year, I managed it better. And then over time, the more we understood where the other person came from, the more we also were willing to compromise and work together. Sometimes we did things more my style. Sometimes we did things more his style. And we developed trust that at the end of the day, we weren't trying to hurt each other. We were just trying to figure out our two styles. And these days, we don't even have that $1,000 no questions asked budget anymore. We pretty much do trust in each other's decisions making. At this point in our marriage, it's been 11 years, so I'm glad that's been happening.
And as you think about the progression of that trust building over time, what did that look like? So it started off with $1,000. What happened kind of between then and now?
Yeah. Being the spender, the relative spender in the relationship, for me, I needed assurance that, okay, when we do have plenty, like when we've met our goals, there should be something nice and extra. And typically, you don't see this happen until end of year bonuses, right? I did see evidence that my husband was willing to do an extra celebratory thing when we got our bonuses. One year, he got me this a professional backpack from Toomey that I really, really wanted, but he did it in his own style. He actually figured out that his company had a corporate discount. So he got it on sale, but it was still, a new backpack, but he just saved a couple $100 doing that. And then little things here and there where I over time realized that he too was making his own personal sacrifices for my comfort. Whereas like I felt like I was sacrificing to try to meet his more frugal standards. At some times he was like, look, he wouldn't do this, but he's willing to do it because he knows that I really wanted it. And then so evidence of that back and forth over time, not saying it's perfect, but over time it built that trust.
One of the things I love most about that is I think it does capture that it's not like you 11 years later have ended up as in this exact same place as you each think about saving or spending, and that's actually okay. And that you found peace with taking turns, which I think is that compromise is so important, and that not needing the other person to be exactly, how I am is, I think, actually so healthy.
Yeah, I joke when we plan new trips, we're like, is this my style or your style? We actually have trips where we overtly say this is the luxury trip, and then we'll have trips where we're saying this is like the backpacker trip.
I love that. I am curious, as you think about planning goals, like, for example, even that travel trip where it's like, this is the backpack trip, where it's not as like the nicer trip. How do you handle that conversation when maybe one of you is like, oh, this is going to be, we either need to spend more or we need to save more. And you guys have, these two different perspectives.
Yeah, it was tough because at the end of the day, the main goal has to be a goal that both of you agree on. And it can be something as broad as, hey, let's both agree on the idea that we're going to save enough to cover retirement. Like that can be a beginner goal for a newly married couple. For us, it was a very, very ambitious goal of living off of the lower of our two incomes for the rest of our lives in high cost of living areas. Like, I think we just have to recognize that I bought into the goal, but I also knew that the goal was extremely difficult and extremely ambitious. And there were times when I doubted it. I was like, okay, we figured out the budget. We know how much to spend, but the margin of error is extremely thin. And I think we were just lucky that nothing majorly terrible happened to us. Like we didn't have, a lot of layoffs or, stock market crash in those early years, because I think I would probably be telling you something different. But I did agree on the idea that I wanted to buy back my freedom later on in life when it was harder to do so as a parent. I wasn't a parent when we got married, but I knew things would be difficult. And so by constantly reminding each other of this is what we agreed on, that made the disagreements in between a little bit better because we kept coming back to the idea of, but do you still agree that this is the goal? I'm like, yes, this is the goal. I'm just complaining because it's really hard and recognizing that sometimes I was just venting. So
Yeah. And one thing that you mentioned there is really focusing on the goal that you shared together. When you were setting your goals, did you guys ever have personal goals in addition to shared goals?
it was interesting. I think at that time, no, we're both of the mindset that if you make things simpler, you're more likely to accomplish them. So the idea is that if you can live off the lower of your two incomes, you can accomplish a lot of things in your life. And then so later on, when I had the idea of starting Save My Sense, which was, coming out of many different entrepreneurial experiences, or now the reality today where I am the default parent, I stay more at home, I take care of the kids, I'm more flexible in my work. I don't think either of us could have envisioned what that would have looked like 11 years ago. So I actually think starting simple takes the pressure off of both people to have to be so specific about what it is that you want, but more like, hey, let's just start by aiming and shooting our arrows in the same direction and not at each other. And then eventually we'll get both of our arrows to land in the bullseye, so to speak.
Yeah, I love that a lot. And, as you guys were having some of these conversations around your goals, now that you've reached FIRE, how do you think about what goals you have moving forward?
Oh my goodness, the $100 million question, because I asked that a lot to my husband. I'm like, don't you want to do something different? He's still working a corporate job. He's been with the same company since 2018, and he more or less seems content, or he doesn't really have another idea. Whereas I'm always brimming with ideas for what I want to do with Save My Sense. So I think that still speaks to our different personalities, in that I am the kind of person who wants to impact people through my work in a very grassroots kind of manner. Like I do work with people one-on-one in private coaching. That's a very time intensive kind of work. Whereas a lot of other personal finance creators, they might just do like, a big course or like a download or something like that, or just online content. And so, I'd say that right now, I have probably a clearer vision than my husband. I'm open to hearing what he has to say, but maybe a part of it is also just, our kids are 5 and 2. So much of our personal time is just focused on making sure that they don't kill themselves in everyday life.
That makes a lot of sense. And, when you are working with these couples in these one-on-one sessions, which also I think is so incredible that you do that, because I feel like you're able to provide so much more in-depth support there. When you are working with these couples, how do you help them navigate the conversations about where are we? What do we want to do with our
Yeah.
lives? What does that mean as a financial goal?
Yeah. I list a couple of goals in my intake survey where I'm like, hey, how important is it to you to retire? How important is it to retire early? Because I do have a lot of FIRE couples. For people who don't have kids, it's like, is it important for you to have kids? Is it important for you to provide for college for your children? How much do you care about real estate as an investment vehicle? Any other goals? And I have each person rank those goals. And so oftentimes I do get a survey back where one person ranks another goal significantly higher than the other. And when those differences arise, then I bring up the question. I'm like, are you okay if one person chooses to retire a little bit earlier than the other? And oftentimes I find out that's okay. And then so to the person who wants to retire earlier, I'm like, okay, I'm going to forecast a scenario that allows this to happen, but I'm not going to forecast a scenario where both of you are going to try to retire early because that requires more savings.
Yeah.
And that's probably not the speed that your spouse wants to go at. And then you're just going to have to be okay with that and recognize your differences. But what I do like seeing is that even though early retirement might not be the answer for the other person, they still do want to retire, which is good. If like one person's like, nah, retirement's never going to happen, I'm going to die early, then that's like a bigger problem that we need to really dig into. And sometimes I do recommend marriage therapy when I see no alignment between two people.
Yeah. And one of the things you touched on that's so fascinating is, the concept of even just having two people who it's okay that they have their own pace for saving because they have slightly different retirement goals. How do you think more broadly about how to help a couple understand what are things they should be doing separately versus what are the things they should be doing together?
Great question. And this is also very commonly asked of me when people think about marriage, just like, when should we have a prenup? Because a prenup oftentimes spells out the differences in opinions between the two, or whether they just differ with the state law when it comes to assets and stuff. So things that I often consider not within the marriage are, number one, if you have extramarital children. Like those children came from outside the marriage, they're another mouth to feed, they are the parent's responsibility, there has to be a budget for that child. Number two, if you're dealing with a business that you had founded with other co-founders that are not in a marriage, which is very common. Obviously, you own the business together with your husband, but more often I see people with outside partners. And those partners have a say in the business. And so unless the non-business spouse is actually bought into the business, I don't think they really have a say over the strategy of that business, and that those finances are kept separate. Then third, this one's very tricky because it is very emotional, family money. If one or both of the spouses inherit or stand to inherit a large sum of assets from their families, that often comes with strings attached. And I think that if you're being gifted money, you should be listening to the person who's gifting the money. And I don't think it's as appropriate for the non-inheritor to be like, okay, well, we got this cash. Now we're going to, go buy me a boat or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And as you're thinking about working with these couples to create a plan for how much should we be saving versus spending, what is that conversation like and how do you navigate that with couples?
Yeah, and also depends on where they are in the relationship. In general, I never recommend shared finances until you are actually legally married because there's no legal requirement. Actually, even after marriage, there's no legal requirement for you to merge things. Number two, I also want a person who's dating or in a long-term relationship to ensure that there is no financial abuse in the relationship, which is extremely dangerous. I have seen instances where I've had to coach victims of financial abuse, where what happened during the relationship was that the other person gained control of all finances, either by forcing the victim to no longer work or by forcing the victim to be the one with the income. But then they take all the money away, give the victim no agency, no control over the money. And that's something that that if you do share your finances before marriage is so hard to get out of. So once we rule out those two things, then I tell the couple, I'm like, if you don't have the, extramarital children, the business, the inheritance, and the two of you are on the same page, goals-wise, then scientific studies actually show a shared finances mindset leads to faster achievement of your financial goals and better relationship satisfaction, more sex. And so, with that evidence, what do you think? And I do pose that question back to the couple. And there can be degrees of sharing finances. Like some people are not comfortable putting everything together. I totally get it. If you are a past victim of abuse, it's very common for those victims to always have a separate fund, which I call the escape fund or the FU fund, Because what if you landed in another abusive relationship? You just don't want to relive that again. I totally think that's appropriate. So some people might have one separate savings fund just for themselves. And then some people might say, okay, everything touching the household, the rent, the car, the groceries, the phone bills, we're going to pull all that money together into one account. And then each person also has like their own spending budget. And some people are like, yes, we're going to go all in. We're going to make it super, super official and everything. And I'm like, yeah, for me, how you do it matters less than whether you choose to do it or not. I'm like, it's shared money is more about the shared mindset and less about the making sure that all your accounts have both names on it.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And as you're thinking about, the couples that you work with, I'm sure you've also navigated this question for yourself, which is how do you think about juggling and planning for a chapter where you are a family and you do have kids? So how have you thought about both working with couples for planning towards that and also what that's looked like for you too?
Yeah. A great piece of advice given to me by a mother before I had children was she asked, hey, what's your parenting philosophy? And do the two of you, she was referring to me and my husband, do the two of you share it? I was like, what's a parenting philosophy? So she kind of explained to me, she's like, look, like you must have certain beliefs and values around how you want to raise your children, what kind of punishment you want and what you want them to focus on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Talk that out before you have your first kid. And even though you're not going to execute exactly what you plan on, but at least have that philosophy in place. And when financially, I always ask expectant or hoping to be parents, I'm like, what's your childcare plan and what's your schooling plan? Those are financially the biggest changes to your budget because if you choose to hire a nanny, do like a daycare, au pair, or something like that, that's going to cost a lot of money because most people these days don't have their parents or like live-in parents to rely on. Number one. Then two, public or private school. Because if you choose private school route, well, there's a fee to save for that. And in public, then that might involve moving to a higher cost district, buying a higher cost house with really high property taxes to fund those nice schools. So get on the same page with that, and then we plan it out. And then there's also the career question of do one or both people want to pull back from their careers to save time at home, especially if they don't want to have the full-time nannies? And oh my goodness, that's probably the number one hardest question for any parent to work with, especially if you came from a very career-focused background, which is what both myself and my husband grew up with.
Mm-hmm. So then what do you do in that case?
I think you just try it because I've done both. So the first thing I did was actually I took a whole year off from management consulting. I was really lucky that they had a policy in place where they'll hold your seat for up to a year. It's not paid. I got 16 weeks of paid leave. The rest was unpaid. I even fell off the health insurance plan, so I had to get on my husband's to see if full-time stay-at-home mom life was for me. And I credit being fired to allow me to financially do that and not have to worry about the financial implications. As it turns out, it was a complete disaster. I had postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety. I needed to work in some capacity. It doesn't have to be full-time management consulting, but I needed to use my brain. So eventually, after trying other things and not doing great, like I actually went back to full-time consulting. That really burned me out even further. Then I went to full-time corporate, which was a good in-between, but I still felt unsettled. And finally, my light bulb turned on in my head because I was like, Shang, you're kind of like fighting yourself. And finally, I took the plunge to be what I call part-time at Save My Sense. I don't work full-time hours. Plenty of hours during the day are dedicated towards my children and their health, their wellness, their education. And right now that works. And I would say it's more about creating a situation where you can have the options to choose, to try things, knowing that your time with your children is not forever. You know, it's only about these 18 to 20 years or so that they're at home that you'll have to wrestle with this. And then I also coach plenty of parents who now are on the other side. Their children are independent or their children off to college. Many parents come up with second careers or new ventures. And that's really great too. Like, it's not a black or white of like the moment you become a parent, your career's done for.
Yeah. And let's say, you're working with a couple where they didn't know as much about personal finance. So they're starting now in their 30s. How do you help them get over this feeling of, oh, maybe am I behind? Like, maybe I could have started earlier, should have, would have, could have.
I would have a lot more money if every person said I feel behind on finances, gave me $1 when they said it. Everyone feels that way. And I think like we put undue pressure on ourselves based on what we see around us. Like everybody is quantified and judged in some way. Like when we talk about the billionaires, we describe them as billionaires, right? Like the net worth is the number one word that we use to describe people and identify them. And right now, at the time of recording, we're entering holiday season. Lots of people feel very judged for the way that they gift because they're afraid that the cost of the gift is not good enough to justify the relationship or whatever. Everybody feels judgment all the time. And in my book, Wealth is a Mindset, I laid that thought to rest. I said, we judge everybody else by numbers, but it's not fair. It's not a good way to actually dig into our self-worth. We have to start with this idea of that you are worthy, that you have everything within you to be good at personal finances because you want a better life for yourself. Let's start there. Let's erase the past shame and regret and operate from a mode of abundance where we're not going to beat ourselves up. And when people stop beating themselves up, they're a lot more likely to then learn a new skill set, stick with a new habit, even when it gets uncomfortable. Because the moment you feel that discomfort and you still have those regrets, you give up because you're like, I struggle, therefore I must not be doing something right. Whereas I'm like, you're going to learn something new, you're going to struggle, but that's a sign that you're evolving and changing for the better.
I feel like that is such great advice to end our show on and so foundational to the mindset shift needed to build wealth where it's not too late. You are enough. Shang, thank you so much for making time to join us on our show and bring your wisdom and experience and your personal story. That is so inspiring, I think, for others to hear that it is possible and it can be possible for them too. So thank you so much for making time to join us.
Thank you.